All right, I think we'll get started. Hi, everyone. My name is Olka Joshi Hansen. I'm Chief Program Officer at Grantmakers for Education. I want to thank you all for joining us today for the fourth in a series on the future of education that we are teaming up with PDK and the Spencer Foundation to run for our members. Today's topic is new considerations around educational assessment, and we're incredibly happy to have a panel that is provocative and really pushing the edges of thinking around these issues. I will hand it off now to Josh Starr, who is Editor-in-Chief and Chief Executive Officer of PDK International. Thank you for being here, Josh.
Thank you, Olka, and I appreciate the additional responsibilities I was just given, although I would never be able to fulfill them. I have a hard enough time editing my own stuff, as Raphael will tell you. So great to see everybody. It's a real pleasure to have a fourth webinar in our conversation about the future of education and the possibilities. When we started this series with Spencer and now the partnership with GFE, the idea is really to explore what's possible in the next 25 years. We're so bogged down with the world we've been coming out of. We're obviously so consumed with issues around all the current things happening both in state legislatures, but of course the COVID pandemic. And we want to create some space to explore what's possible in the future in the next 25 years. We've invited a number of wonderful people to write and then respond to some key questions about that. And so today we get to talk about assessment, which is something that has certainly come up in our previous conversations around curriculum, around accountability, and we get to drill down a little more with a fabulous panel. And what I love about these conversations is that they sit at the intersection of the theories that many funders have about what they want to see happen and what they wish would happen, and these great ideas that they're always seeding out there. The research that has been done that says, well, this is the reality of what, this is what we should do if you actually want to, there's a treatment, there's an effect, and do more of that. And then the reality practitioners to say, hey, wait a second, here's, what about, the actual implementation of some of these practices. And this conversation has always been around the messy middle. So I am going to introduce our panelists. I'm going to ask them to kind of open it up a little bit with some commentary. I have some questions and I'm going to steer the conversation, and then please use, I think we have the chat function and the Q&A function, use either one. To weigh in and ask some questions. So today we are really fortunate to have just three great thinkers and leaders with us. You can see we have Gabby Lopez, who is the Director of Research to Practice Measures at CZI, Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. We have Bill Penuel, who's Professor at the Institute of Cognitive Science and the School of Education at University of Colorado. And we have Ivory Toldson, who is Professor and Director of Education, Innovation, and Research at Howard, is the Editor-in-Chief of the Journal of Negro Education, and is the National Director of Education for the NAACP. So it's really great to have all three of you to kind of tackle this question of assessments and what's possible from different perspectives. So we're going to start with Bill, because you wrote the piece for us that kind of got this going. And I do encourage people to go on the website and look at all the back and forth, because it's some really good conversation. So Bill, take a couple minutes, lay out your main arguments, and then we're gonna go from there.
That's good. Thank you so much, Josh. I'd like to begin just by saying I'm coming to you from the traditional homelands of the Ute, Arapaho, and Cheyennes people, and more than 48 contemporary tribes here in what's known as Boulder, Colorado. So I guess in framing this conversation too, I want to share the frames that I begin with, one of which I was given, but I also really enjoyed, which is I was invited to think not just about the present possible, but the future possible. And in that spirit, I really took Arundhati Roy's notion of the pandemic as a possible portal to a new world. And I think that we really do need to be thinking about designing assessment for a different world, a world in transition, a world characterized by climate emergency, by a moment of possible racial reckoning still that lives with us in the United States in particular, but also with respect to the impacts of global capitalism. So I really hope that we can have a conversation today about assessment that considers that long time horizon. And I took that seriously. I also centered equity and justice. And for me, that really begins with a consideration of a cultural theory of how people learn, that people learn in cultural communities over time across settings. And that hasn't been the governing theory of our assessments. We've been driven by individual cognitive theory and behavioral theories, where we could think we could break down goals into very discrete bits, and that we were about the game of assessing individual learning as if individuals were working in learning in isolation from others. So that's a beginning place for me. And a couple of key arguments here was that we should really think of the abundant sources of student work as a key beginning place, as opposed to the poverty of a test on one day for getting information about what it is our students know and can do. That a fair assessment system actually is not agnostic about the curriculum that is used, but actually has knowledge of assessment of the curriculum that's being used, and where there is a system that has guaranteed equitable access to high quality resources that would reflect what I would call cultural-based pedagogies, whether that's culturally responsive or culturally sustaining pedagogies. That we know something about the access to opportunities to learn, so that we could judge whether at the end of the day, if we did have such a big end of year test, whether it was because of our curriculum materials or there was some need in professional learning, for example, or we really did need to work specifically to support individual students. So I really begin with that place that we should start with classroom assessment for learning and think about moving up. And what do we need as a system? What infrastructures do we need at district and state levels that would support teachers being able to adapt, create, use high quality assessments embedded in curriculum materials in order to really support just and equitable learning, as well as conversations with parents and community in ways that engage them richly in conversations about what students should learn and what students are learning. So that's my argument in a nutshell. I'll stop there.
All right. And I also love the fact for you longtime webinar participants, we started the conversation with curriculum a few months ago, and I love the fact that we continue to sort of drill down on these issues, that what we teach is really important, and then how we know whether what we teach is having an effect is also important. So I love that we're going to explore that today. So Gabby, you've been doing a lot of work on the science of learning at CZI, and I know you also do a lot of work with, like, engage with teachers around these questions. And so how do you, given what you've been learning in that work, what's your take on what Bill laid out?
We actually fundamentally agree on the fact that our assessment systems actually need to be deeply connected to what's happening in classrooms. There are also some other aspects that I think we are committed to in our work and exploring, and that is, how do we fundamentally support a young person's agency in a classroom, and an educator's agency, and a family's agency in informing what that defining that cultural learning. And it's a deep challenge that we hold because of issues that I know we'll be discussing as we move forward. But I always come back to this space of, if you will, I spent the last 25 years working in early childhood and K-12 settings, particularly using assessments to define quality across these settings. And one of the challenges that comes up consistently across the board is the fact that educators don't actually see assessments and those processes supporting and aligning to what it is that they see and want for their young people that are in their spaces. And if they don't see that, to Bill's earlier point, then families have a hard time seeing that. And deepening that connection across the board is something that we are deeply thinking about, learning about, because there's lots of complexity there in human behavior, and understanding that all learning is social, all learning is cultural, it's relational. And we haven't actually set up our school systems in our ecosystem to really lift and center and anchor in that learning and knowledge.
So I want to go to Ivory, but before I do, you said something that just you said a lot of things that really resonate, but this idea of there being a wall between, that's my language, not yours, between what is taught and what is assessed, right, is how I'm hearing that, and I want to make sure that I'm hearing that correctly. Is that intentional? Is that by design? I mean, what do y'all think about that? Because in some ways, right, we've been focused on this notion of standards and accountability and assessment to drive a certain theory of how schools will improve. And it may be that you want to keep teachers away from that, or teacher practice away from that. Is that by design? Maybe let's say that simple. Or am I just getting on crazy conspiracy theories here? And any of you can jump into that before I then turn it over to Ivory. So
my quick answer to that, quick unfulfilling answer is yes, it is by design. And it's because we have built a system on that anchors on subjectivity, and learning is not subjective. So I'll kick it over to any of my colleagues that want. All
right, so I'll give a chance, because I have a feeling Bill's going to want to weigh in on that. But I want to give a chance to Ivory here to kind of think about this. So you've been doing some work, and I've been following this for a long time. I'm really thinking about equity issues and how our assessment practices it can actually be damaging to lots of our kids, particularly Black boys that I know you've studied, but I know you're going to way beyond that. Talk a little bit about your take on the issue from your experience and your lens, Ivory.
Okay, thank you. And I appreciate you organizing this panel. So I just dropped some assessment information in the chat. So this is a ACT score that's 17, high school GPA that's 2.7, reading proficiency below basic, grade school score of the high school 1 out of 10, number of parents in the household 1, zip code highest crime rate in the city. So these are all numbers that we can use to understand a student's potential, and that we typically do use. Now, a lot of times when I share this information and I don't reveal who it is, there's some pretty dire prognostications that come through. But this is my profile as a high school senior. Now, I did end up going to LSU, Louisiana State University, graduated in 4 years, went to Penn State for a master's, Temple for a PhD, and went on to do a lot of other things that made my mama proud. Now, a lot of times when people see this and juxtapose that against where I am right now, there's a tendency to think that I beat the odds. I don't think that I beat the odds. I just think that there's more important information about me. And if you had that information, that you would be able to predict that I would do well in college. Also, a lot of times, so one of the things that I talk about in my own writing is that we should use people to understand numbers, not numbers to understand people. I could give you an explanation of every single number that's up there, and you would get it. And you'll understand that what you thought about that number didn't apply to me, and it probably doesn't apply to a lot of other students. So these are some of the things that we have to think about when it comes to assessment. I really like Bill's work and thinking about the future of assessments, and I look forward to talking more about that.
Gabby, you want to jump in for a sec?
I do want to jump in for a sec. I actually meant learning is not objective, it is subjective, because it is subjective. It is, we understand our world through our experiences, individual and cultural experiences. And from that perspective, it's absolutely 100% subjective, and it's not objective. And our assessment systems are designed with objectivity at the center versus understanding how we connect and understand and connect to our world and our lived experiences, our families, communities, etc.
So I have a feeling, Bill, you're gonna want to respond to that question. I guess one question is it possible to design an objective assessment? Right? And anybody just jump in on that. Yeah.
You mean possible to design a subjective assessment? You said.
Well, no, I think that the challenge.
Oh,
here,
okay. Okay, I got it.
Maybe it gets to this question. Maybe let me ask the question a different way. I think that because some people are deeply immersed and involved in this conversation and know a lot about it, and then there are a lot of people that just make assumptions about the value of the assessments, and there are policies around it and practices, and we've been very wedded to those over the last 25 years, right? What have we gotten wrong? What incorrect assumptions do we have about the value and merit of the current assessment practices? And I ask that because I want to take us then to what should we be doing? So what are we getting wrong? What are our wrong assumptions?
Right. So I think one thing is that we have a much more ambitious set of learning goals that are embodied in our standards than can be assessed adequately, especially at the end of year tests. And they have had some pretty harmful and in some ways unintended harmful consequences of testing regimes that are tied to accountability that are connected to that. So one of the consequences of having ambitious learning goals and multiple choice tests and partly fall from the fact that we have to test every child in every grade in these core subject areas. And we are prohibited from using the kinds of sampling techniques that NAEP uses, for example, of matrix sampling, where we could actually give kids very rich problems if we were to not have to test every kid. So once we're given a certain amount of number of dollars per kid, and we say we also have to test every kid every year on every standard, we're really setting ourselves up to have the kinds of assessments that don't match up with the ambitious learning goals that are reflected in our standards. And in terms of the harms of testing, one, there's the meta-analyses and National Academy's reports suggest that testing as test-based incentives for accountability have at best a very small effect, especially relative to, say, the effects of a high-quality curriculum and professional development combined on student learning. So part of it is, what's our theory of action here? I think our theory of action is that tests are going to make by themselves are going to be enough to get us towards equitable outcomes. And so I think that's something too, is like, what's our theory of action here? Is that credible? What evidence is there for that theory of action? And in my area, in science especially, we test in elementary, we test in ELA and math. And one direct consequence of that, and not testing in science, is that kids get on average 20 minutes a day of science instruction. We have narrowed the curriculum so that all children, and to me, this is a civil rights issue of access to science, access to social studies, access to world languages and arts. And accountability-based pressure has torqued our curriculum, and it has had unequal effects on Black and brown kids and kids in poor schools that are under the thumb of accountability pressures. Not all schools, but those that have that particular suite of configuration where those associations are really strong.
Okay, so one thing I think is important about what you just said, and I mean lots of things, but standards aren't the problem necessarily. And I think people sometimes convolute this sort of assessment with standards and all that. And you answered the question I was gonna ask about whether we have evidence that curriculum has been narrowed as a result of testing. I think we can accept that, right? So if standards aren't the problem though, and narrow assessments that that narrow the experiences kids have, right? Gabby, Ivory, what do we start doing? How do we start digging ourselves out of that hole? And I said both Gabby, Ivory, either one of you can jump in on that. If we accept the premise that standards aren't the problem, that the assessment, but the assessments narrow the curriculum, narrow the experience kids have, what can we start doing about it?
Yeah, I really think it depends on how you define standards.
Hmm.
Standards, as we look at them now, are very narrow, they're rigid, they're fixed. Um, True standards, there's a bit of relativity when it comes to authentic standards, and there is going to be some differences across individuals, across communities. I mean, just basic, what are some of the things that you are interested in? What are your goals? Those are all different. So why can't our standards be different too? And I think that a lot of the assessments that we have right now are out of convenience, not out of what is really really important or really useful. We first started using the SAT in 1926, so it's going to be 100 years old in a few years. And though the content has changed, the format hasn't really changed, and the theory behind it hasn't really changed. But society has changed quite a bit, and our capacity has changed a lot. I talk about all of the information that people didn't have on me. Things like my involvement with the school newspaper, being the editor of the school newspaper, reading things outside of school. Now, today, theoretically, with blockchain technology and things like that, we could give every student a digital wallet. And so some of those things that people didn't have on me could be authenticated on the blockchain, go into my digital wallet. And so when a college evaluates me, they're not just seeing a SAT score and a GPA, but they're seeing all these authenticated experiences that perhaps has more to do with my ability to succeed than some of these rigid tests that we have that's based on these standards. So we really do need to think, in more modern terms about how we go about assessing students.
Gabby, what's your take on this relationship between standards, assessment, narrowing curriculum, and all that? And then we're going to talk personalization.
Yeah, it is, if we think future facing, we have to think multidimensional. And that's what Ivory is speaking towards, what I'm hearing from Ivory, and also what I'm hearing from Bill to some degree. And it means that we have to be willing to acknowledge in our assessment systems that the human experience is complex, and that we're not going to capture it in one assessment or another, or it may not be appropriate to capture in an assessment. And it means collective value centering, and standards to some degree help you do that. They don't help you do that if they remain fixed. And in any good assessment, any good tool will actually build in the ability to iterate over time so that you do learn, and we can leverage what we've learned most currently in what it is to be a learner in the modern world.
All right, so we're going to get to personalization, but I'm struggling here, right? And I am struggling, and I've been a proponent of moving away from state standardized tests for a long time and all that, and I was certainly no fan of NCLB, but I do believe that there is a soft bigotry of low expectations, and I do believe that with NCLB, we actually finally had a way to, we had sort of proof. Now, whether or not we agree on that standard, on state standardized test as the standard for everybody, there was some utility in that. And I fear that those who want to continue to have American public education being the ranking sorting mechanism for American society, right, well, then say, okay, let's have different standards for different kinds of kids. And we know what that has led to before. So how, and there's a lot in there, I know, but how do we acknowledge what you said, Gabby, which is so powerful about community-driven standards and the need for, and Ivory, what I heard you say as well, and even our ability to manage that differentiation of standards with the deep equity issues that have always existed in our system. That's what I don't know how to make that leap. So help me here.
I wanted to think about the spirit of assessment. What is assessment for? It's to determine someone's potential, someone's capacity, to determine the extent to which they have translated different things that they've done into life skills. And I don't think that the assessments that we use through No Child Left Behind really got at that. And I think that there's a lot of conditioning that we've all gone through that's made us think that some pretty artificial things are the most important things that we should be looking at. You know, we can have a student that actually won a science fair, and we don't look at that. You know, we don't measure that in their capacity, but we'll look at how they did on a standardized test, and the way that the questions come out. You know, in this discrete, compartmentalized. You have to use this deductive type way. This student that won the science fair, they may think more holistically, and so they actually have the better capacity to be a scientist than someone who does better on the test. But because we've ignored the science fair competition and put everything in this paper assessment, we lose this kid. So it's really about looking at everything. And when we look at what colleges ask for, a lot of times they ask the right stuff on their college application. They just don't use it. So, like you're asking the clubs and organizations that I've been in for a reason. You're asking whether I have been in SGA for a reason. You're asking if I had a foreign language for a reason. But then when it comes to selecting me, you're using two things, the two easiest things for you to use. So we know it's about simplicity. It's not about authenticity. And I think that, if we need to put in artificial intelligence to help, college admissions out, then I think we can do that. But we have to acknowledge that all of these things that we are ignoring are probably most likely more important than the things that we put so much energy in.
Can I build on this? Because I think what Ivory's inviting us to do, I'm going to invoke the long time horizon now and say, when we think about purposes, what do we want the purposes to be of schooling? And also Ivory's inviting us to think about what is the role of school within a larger ecosystem in which children and youth are learning and growing and becoming, and how do we help them become towards more just and sustainable communities? And so we would reorganize a lot in schools, and including assessment, to think about that. And for me, I want to invoke my colleague Phil Bell's notion of how would assessment help build caring relationships among students, parents, teachers, community members? How does it actually help with care, with relationship, with community? What if we thought about assessment that way? What world would we create through such assessments? What new relations between or among schools and communities and families would that build if we began there? And that's the invitation to think long. And as Ivory points out, we're already there. Kids are already living and becoming in wider ecosystems that encompass but are not limited by schools.
Gabby, what's your take? Does that formulate my question about personalization?
I am deeply moved by the conversation. I think that we have, at the core of assessment and measures development, is this idea that you're building it on a foundational belief. And if we build our assessments on a foundational belief of humanizing one another and humanizing each other's experience, and our ability and our community's ability to move society forward, and that we each depended on one another for that, it would be fundamentally different than what we have now, which is the identification of your individual ability or capacity to succeed in a system that has already been designed, in your words, Josh, and what we all understand, sorting and moving people through different pathways. And those pathways have been designed on specific beliefs about people that look like me or that come from backgrounds like me, and what role I should serve in society, and therefore what access to the level of education I should have. And what we're describing here for future is actually about seeing one another fundamentally different and contributing to a different society. And assessment can support that. It should not be the thing that it is anchored on, but it can support that vision.
So I appreciate how both of you or all of you are doing a better job of moving us to where we need to be than I am. It's supposed to be my job, right? So I guess let's talk a little about personalization, but I wanna talk about it in a way that may be a little convoluted, but bear with me for a sec here. Because this is a conversation for funders, right? This is a community for funders. And I would say that there's sort of two things that are happening right now that I've been seeing, and it's been for a little while. This real people are very enamored with personalization for a whole bunch of reasons, whether it's the technological solutions to it, they can make it teacher proof, although I know that's only some folks, or just this idea that we should activate kids' individual passions and see them as individuals, and that you know, and kids have to be ready to, you know, go out into the world and embrace it on their own terms, and personalization helps with that, right? But there's also the funding community is complicit in this. There's an enormous amount of architecture and infrastructure that has emerged in school systems around the assessment regime, right? And how do so as we think about the next 25 years, if we assume that some degree of personalization is better, and we can debate that, right? But you know, which I would say it encaptures a lot of what you're talking about. Yet we have this architecture that has been built up for so many years and is so well supported in policy and in product and in the life of schools, right? 25 years of the NCLB generation, the current educators, they came through all that work. What kinds of practices in the next 5 years, let's say, what kind of adult practices should we start organizing around to actually break down that current standardized testing hegemony that exists, that is so dominant in everything we do? That was a long way of getting to it, but tell me about, like, if you could tell what funders what to do over the next 5 years to start getting to what you all are describing, what kind of adult practices should they invest in? And that's open. Whoever wants to chime in first, jump in.
Yeah, so and I can't really talk about the testing regime or the testing industrial complex or anything like that. I can talk about authenticity when it comes to assessment and evaluation. Now, a lot of times we look at private schools, you know, these elite private schools as being schools that are having successful outcomes. But it's interesting that their relationship to standardized tests is a lot different than the public school system. You know, they don't use them to evaluate their students the way that we do. And they don't seem to have this difficulty, you know, like it just seems like people are struggling to find, you know, like, what do we do if we don't have these standardized assessments and we're looking at it in the exact same way as, you know, this, you know, really compartmentalized way. To me, it doesn't seem that difficult to ask students, like, how many books have you read outside of school? And to me, it seems like that would mean something. You know, it seems like that would mean more to me than how well they did on a reading assessment. I talked about my below basic level on reading tests, but I did read a lot of books outside of school. The way that the reading test is constructed, you just would not know my capacity to read because of that, because I'm too inductive of a thinker. I draw in too much information when I'm reading. I like to connect things to my experiences when I read. So I'm not going to answer those questions well, even today. So there are many schools that do very well by their students and do not use standardized tests. Now, to get them in college, a lot of times they start training them on a particular standardized test, and that's the ACT and the SAT. But as an ongoing process of understanding how their students are doing, they do not use the test. Some of the highest performing schools in our nation. So we have the evidence that we don't need tests in order to understand how our students are doing. We need authenticity, asking the right questions, and guiding them to the types of experiences where they can get this holistic knowledge that will be so useful to them.
Gabby, next 5 years, what should we start in? What kind of adult practices should we start investing in? And what kinds of changes should we start seeding some innovative practices into to get to this greater vision of what roles have?
The vision that I outline really depends on having really good quality curriculum materials that are adaptable and localizable for teachers, as well as a very respected, professionalized teaching workforce that knows how to do the work of connecting that content to their students' lives, and also integrating with family and community. So I always say, the goal of really good professional learning for adults in a system is productive adaptation, not implementation with fidelity, because then you're not actually localizing it to the people that are in front of you or to the local policy contexts. When we talk about personalization, I want to then ask, what is the theory of the individual? A lot of times when we talk about personalization, it's that atomic individual isolated from all others. We're going to put some headsets on them and stick them in front of a computer and customize the math problems they see, right? Wait, is that the image of the human that we want to start with? Is that the image of learning and learning in a community? So a lot of the strategies that we encourage and work with teachers in our curriculum work, and I do in my research practice partnership with the Inquiry Hub and with the Open SciEd project, or we call group personalization. How do I help a collective of students come to see themselves in material, in a phenomenon or problem in the community, find their way into their questions, but then pursue them together and pursue answers to those questions together as a collective enterprise? And then that actually simulates more what the discipline is like expecting too, by the way. But it's a form of personalization too, to drive it that way. And it's grounded in the image of a human being as part of a community, as opposed to on their own, having their own isolated learning path.
So invest in great teaching. That's a way to boil it, right? I mean, that's
but we often go about that thinking about great teaching. I'm going to provide some teacher-proof curricula, right, or I'm going to develop you as an individual without materials, right? And both of those are good formulas for failure, I would argue.
Right, and that's where I was going. And Gabby, I think you were going there too.
Yeah, exactly. I think with anything that we build that's intended to be in service of others, in service of a collective, we have to fundamentally come back to the human experience. And we have to come back to people are capable, more than capable, and understand their environments more than more than we have approached this work with in the past. And our tools, products, whatever language we want to use for the complex of instructional learning materials and all of the things, have systematically been created not by those people that are closest to classroom, typically speaking, and have systematically not included those who have been most marginalized by our systems. And yet we collectively claim to understand how to fix them, their community, their learning, the individual. And future facing, we in the next 5 years, and I will, to my funder community, we fundamentally have to challenge ourselves to do that differently. We have to be good consumers, contributors, partners to external communities that are wanting to design with. It means it'll be a different time horizon. It means it might be more complex. It means it's not siloed, all of those things that funders are deeply uncomfortable with.
Yeah, okay, so you just went, all right, I have 3 different things jumping around my head right now. I got to figure out which one I can get to first, because I know there's some questions I want to get to too. But, and Gabby, I so appreciate what you just said, but tell me how, like, what is that, because I will say, from my perspective as a former practitioner, people want to do the right things. And I believe funders want to support the right thing. They don't know how. And so it's just easier to like buy the bright, shiny objects, and than to actually do the work. So what are the, like, talk a little bit about like that, how to get to the activation of those who are closest to the problem, to be able to solve it, right?
Yeah. I as a funder, this was a new world for me. I have to say, it's my first gig in the philanthropic space, and so it is something that I have been learning over the past 4 years that I've been at CZI. And I think the first thing that I would say is check the sense of urgency. Whose urgency is it? And it means that we have to have tolerance for seeing work out in community. And it means not being the people that are always telling others what ideas will be successful. It means listening, it means developing some really strong listening skills. It means developing some really strong relational skills with people that are typically not in a place of comfort. It means putting yourself as a funder in different situations and in different communities to build those relationships and understand. In the same way that we're talking about classrooms being deeply relational and deeply connected, if we are going to support this kind of work moving forward in the philanthropic space, it means decentering philanthropy as the ultimate purveyor of thought leadership, but being in partnership and understanding that we have a role to play as part of this larger puzzle in which our experiences might be very different or are very different than most of the communities that we are so, to your point, like we are committed to being in partnership with.
Right, and that was a really, really wonderful way of also saying that the premise of the question itself was problematic. In that I'm looking for a practice, so I'm looking for something to do, and you flip that really in a wonderful way. So I want to get to questions of scale. I want to get to questions of measuring progress and like function, but I think I want to try to center it for the last bit of our conversation is that what I hear all three of you saying in different ways is that the current assessment regime is limited to only a very narrow view of academic achievement, and that in fact school should be and could be much more than that, right? That's part of what I've heard you say, and we know that it's true, and actually in our polling we've seen some of that, right? That people want more, but then I worry about the way that people are now saying, okay, so that means let's do SEL every 9:45 on Thursday mornings, SEL time. Let's do measures of SEL. And is it possible? So I guess one question is, how do we think differently about assessments to be able to measure some of those more humanistic, let's call them functions of schooling, citizenship functions of schooling? And can you scale those measures to actually evaluate progress in the way you can? Well, I was at reading level X, now I'm a reading level Z, right? Or I was in third grade, now I'm a how do you think about that kind of messiness? And Bill, let's start with you on that, and then we'll go Gabby Ivory. There was a lot of questions in one, but you answer the question you want.
I want to actually start with the legal framework that we're operating under. And so we often talk about the right or access to education, but we don't talk about the right to a meaningful education. My colleague Manuel Espinoza is sponsoring to get legislation passed in Colorado legislature that has that at its core. And I think you have to have that in place to envision different tests that say, well, that ask the question that Mark asked in chat that I think is a great, genuine question. How in the heck would we measure that? I want us to be measuring that, not access, not achievement gaps per se. And I'm happy measuring achievement gaps. Let me say, if they're couched as one piece of a bigger equity puzzle. And we also have resources that we're going to attach to doing something about that that's really different than what we have in place now. But I actually think we need a different legal framework in the states for this. Second, we have to, if we're going to stick to large scale assessment, we have to have matrix sampling. We have to get better assessments and not assess every kid. And we can still get disaggregated data with that. We absolutely can. And then I think we ought to look at other models like an inspectorate, where the sort of standardized tests are more the back check on, okay, we think there's a problem. A district has some authority and there is a problem with equity in the school. Then we have some means of actually going in and giving some feedback and having some corrective measures, but that we don't start with the standardized tests as the basis for that.
Yeah, I always used to say when I was an accountability guy and a superintendent, at best, the data help you ask better questions, right? And you got to have all these other processes to seize on. Gabby, what's your take on these issues of scale and whether assessments can meet some of these other more humanistic purposes of schooling that we're talking about?
The scale question is one that vexes me. I will acknowledge that. Like it is particularly for some of these other when I think of sense of belonging or some of these other areas where we know our assessments are helpful in helping us understand student experience, and student experience is key to learning. And I think it's something that we should value, and we need to explore the unintended consequences of including some of these things in our current structure of accountability systems. I'm intrigued by this idea of the framework, the legal framework that you presented, Bill, and this idea of meaningful education, because that deeply resonates when you think about sense of belonging, sense of self with others, culturally affirming climate work that's happening across the board. I think we have some tools that people are using locally that have not found their way to sort of the scaling question. And so that is one way in which philanthropy, I think, can uniquely play a role, because we do have and should have an appetite for quote unquote investing in risky ventures. And maybe that risk is literally like, is exploring the question, should we all have some metric of sense of belonging? Should we all have some metric of a culturally affirming climate survey that's anchored in cultural relevance? It's those types of questions that I think we have to get smarter about, and not pitting academics against all of these things, but understanding that they're both critically important to ensuring that we are that we have school systems that are preparing young people for civic society. Ultimately, that's what families and parents are saying they want. How are you preparing my child to be a better human being in this society so that we can all be well?
No, Ivory, what's your take?
Yeah, so I think we have to be post-reform in our thinking. And so, we've had this reform era for about 30 years now, which probably hit its pinnacle with the No Child Left Behind era. And there's a lot of ideas like closing the achievement gap, scaling, standardized tests, that was central to the reform era. But we have to try to figure out whether or not some of these things are even relevant to a post-reform era. And I think we should all agree that it is time to usher in a new era. One, the reform era hasn't worked particularly well for us, but two, society has just changed so radically since then. We don't have companies doing focus groups and giving us assessments to see what our preferences are anymore. They're just looking at our social media activity, and they're looking, there's all these other things that they could use to put in your Google feed, the things that you might buy. So we need to think about assessment in the data revolution. The children are generating so much data. We're generating so much data. We have so much more sophisticated ways to understand data. And so from a funding perspective, I would be excited about funding things that help us to pull in more naturalistic data and seeing how we can make some use of that. I talked about perhaps a digital wallet earlier. I think we can have an academic digital wallet. I think there are some people who are exploring that. And I think that would be something that we could look at. And that wouldn't be scaled, that would be personalized. And also data in this human technology frontier. We are becoming part machine, part human. We have these smartphones, they're an extension of who we are. We need to think about how all these changes in society should change the way that our relationship to assessment.
Yeah, and actually, I think what I love about what all of you said is it kind of goes into the next question I have, which may be our last one that Salim brought up about what I would call the total cost of ownership around this. But I think that and part of why I asked the question is scale is I'm always thinking from my previous experience where you have to think across, the 204 schools that I ran or the 20 schools that I ran or the high level policy. And what I hear you all saying is maybe what we need to think about is seeding really, really good practices and creating lots of proof points. And then I would suggest that we do a lot of storytelling around that. And then if we do that, then maybe we'll show there is another way. So that kind of leads to this question, the total cost of ownership, right? When I think about that, there's a lot of investment in people, in training, in stuff, technology, right? You don't just adults don't learn that quickly, right? So if you think about this kind of total cost of ownership around what we should be, how we should organize ourselves over the next 20, 25 years to create these new assessment practices, how do you confront that question? How do you think about that, and maybe break it into bite-sized chunks for folks as we think about the costs associated with all this? It's not just money, there's time, there's people. Like, how do we think about that?
One thing that we do, and if people haven't read the recent report on the future of research at IES, they should. We've banked a lot on intervention research and not on systemic interventions where we change infrastructures in districts, in ecosystems, right? So I think part of where we get a lot of leverage, if you will, from investments is actually shifting the focus of intervention. I do not believe we get to an equitable and just system through building better interventions. Building better interventions is certainly part of it. And you can't do it without fundamental changes inside learning environments and connections between them. But you also can't get there if you keep investing in this linear R&D process where we're going to build an intervention and then plan for scale later if it proves to be effective. Because things that work at scale tend to be designed for scale from the start. And the way we do that is to redesign our infrastructures, whether that's PD, so forth. Sorry.
So sorry to just jump in, but like every morning in my inbox is something about how states are using 40% of their dollars on tutoring because tutoring is going to be right. That's what everyone's doing right now. It's the bright, shiny object. So should we not be doing interventions like tutoring because it's based on the sort of, problematic model described earlier?
No, I'll say something different. I'll say, because I'm somebody who builds curriculum. I'm saying that when I'm building a whole set of things. I'm building across the levels from the start. I'm building the thing that's going to touch kids or touch teachers and kids in a classroom. And I'm also thinking about the professional learning infrastructure that I'm going to have in place for that, as well as preparing the other adults in the system to be able to make room and space for this. I'm also having to think about human resources, whether that's in a school district or charter network. I still have this problem to solve, like who is where in the system, what are the supports for their learning. And I hope I don't have to design that every time I do a new intervention either. But I am going to need to think about this from a more infrastructural perspective.
Got it. Ivory, Gabby, how do you both think about this question, sort of total cost ownership around all this and what it'll take?
I think it's going to take both what Bill and Ivory have mentioned thus far. It's going to take, and in my mind, I organize it in it's these public-private partnerships. It's having the humility to design something that's coherent and understanding that our systems are where our systems are today are not where we want our systems to be necessarily in 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And I don't know that we are, well, I don't know that we're fully there because I think we're so wedded to the idea that an intervention is going to come save everyone or save a subpopulation or whatever the case may be without considering all of the other pieces around it. And that has literally been our crutch until this point. It's buying into that we don't fundamentally have to change our education system.
Yeah. Ivory, what's your take? And then I'm gonna go to my last question.
I feel like where there's a will, there's a way. And you know, I don't think the way is a problem. I think it's the will.
Well, but yeah, so I agree with that in lots of ways, but I also think people may not know how to think about, again, the total cost, like how to think about the gestalt, right? That there's a lot of moving parts here that have to be dealt with if we're going to actually move towards what you're all describing.
Yeah, I think when there's a universal understanding that the assessments that we have are inadequate and that we want more naturalistic and holistic types of assessments, when there's a universal understanding of that, I have no doubt in my mind that they'll be able to find the investment to make that happen. I just don't think that we're there yet, like Gabby said.
Yeah, well, and actually what I love about that's actually something I think funders can really do, is help. I mean, there's a lot of influence there, and I do think that funders can help with creating more universal understanding of what's possible and what's problematic. So let me I'll leave with one last question. It's a speed round. I always like to end on something hopeful, and I'll go Ivory, Gabby, Bill, in reverse order from what just spoke. What's just like the most hopeful or joyous thing you've seen in schools or in education these days?
I would recommend that anyone go to what they consider the worst performing high school in the city or the district, go to their graduation.
Yeah.
Hear from the valedictorian, see where the top students are going. There's pockets of success. We don't use them as effectively as we should, but there's a whole lot that we can learn from those students.
Got it. Gabby, what's the most hopeful or joyous thing you've seen these days?
Young people designing assessments with their educators. I think it's brilliant.
Yeah, it's so powerful when you actually involve them in that stuff. Yeah. Bill.
Me, coming out of the pandemic, the deep appreciation of how important care and relationships are with our students, with colleagues, with families. I get to work with educators in a course on compassion and dignity, and people are really dug in to how it is to create more compassionate schools in a way that I think has been opened up by the pandemic.
Yeah, powerful. So to everybody on there, please go in the chat, click on the links. There's been more action in this chat than I've seen in any others. It's actually been harder for me to keep up. Usually I can. So go in there, click on all the links. Gabby Lopez, Ivory Tolton, and Bill Penuel, thank you so much for being with us today. Just another really rich conversation that I appreciate you being part of, and that I'm privileged to be in. And thank you for all your work. At that, I will turn it back over to Olka, who will take us home.
I also want to add my thanks to you all for digging into the hard, complicated, messy questions. And I think the chat engagement was a testament to your thoughtful kind of engagement. So thank you. For those of us who joined us, thank you for spending part of your afternoon with us. You can see other recordings, the first 4 in this series on our website at funders.org. And you're seeing on your screen a list of upcoming programs, the next of which is April 25th. What happens when we connect selective colleges with historically marginalized high schools? Hope you can join us for some future programming. Thank you.